Welcome, everyone. I have called Alice Hurricane Alice for years, but in light of the devastation wrought by several hurricanes, including at least one named after a woman, I think I have to change that metaphor. But Alice has incredible power. And when Alice approaches you and says, Jane, there's a fourth ocean and you need to be involved, you get involved. So that's how it happened. And then you add in the charm and incredible creativity of President Oliver Grimson, who's sitting right here. And then you add in the power women who can make something happen on Capitol Hill, and it's a marvelous recipe for progress. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. As Alice said, exactly a year ago on this stage, I announced the Wilson Center Polar Initiative, and its restart was in February. And just to tick off a few things, we hosted a National American Arctic Leaders Summit with the Center for International Governance Innovation. We hosted an Arctic Futures Conference with the University of Toronto, Bill Graham Center, and University of Toronto Munk School. And our director, Mike Sfraga, who's been mentioned, co-hosted the Week of the Arctic in Fairbanks, Alaska, which included the Arctic Council Ministerial. And just in June, President Grimson and, of course, Senator Lisa Murkowski were with us and the Arctic Circle when we hosted the first ever Arctic Circle Forum on the continental United States, and that focused on the U.S. and Russia in the Arctic. As all of you know, the U.S.-Russia story in the Arctic is a good news story, and it's one to build on in the Arctic and hopefully to build on in the world. We just launched the summer edition of the Wilson Quarterly, focused on the Arctic, which you can find online. And of course, yesterday we co-hosted the Munich Security Conference Arctic Security Roundtable. So enough of that, although not enough of that, please check our website. I want to talk about the woman to my left. Lisa just told me in the green room that she's staying the whole weekend so that she can learn more about the Arctic. Now just wrap your heads around this. Here's an experienced senior member of the United States Senate who has come from home to here and is extending her trip because she knows that the people in this room and the topics involved are that important. I often say that Congress is not a learning institution. You get there and you coast on whatever intellectual inventory you brought. A few people try to learn new things and try to use their opportunity, which is a very difficult environment to work in, to add value. And on one hand, Lisa Murkowski is that kind of senator. She has learned more, she leads, she takes risks, and I just hope all of us, just for 1 second, can applaud what she has brought to the United States Senate. So, okay, let's go through a few questions. I know that time is short. The previous U.S. administration, and Alice Hill and some others are here, took an interest in the Arctic, and certainly, and Alaska, and during the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Circle. In your view, will the Arctic be a high priority to the Trump administration, especially now that Finland has assumed the chairmanship from the United States?
The short and quick answer is it must. The Arctic must become that principal initiative. And it's hard because our reality is that right now we're spending a full weekend talking about cooperation in the Arctic. Cooperation doesn't make news. Controversy makes news. I would like to keep the Arctic away from controversy and focused on the level of cooperation and collaboration that has been built. But that makes it hard to kind of vie for attention within the administration. So those of us that have been pushing on this for years will continue to push. My colleague and co-chair of the Arctic Caucus, my bookend on the other end of the country, Senator Angus King, and I have been working to bring more members in, bring more focus in. But in an administration that is still standing up many of its individuals that we would look to for that leadership, there's still some holes. People have been asking me, Lisa, who do we go to? That go-to person is as yet unidentified.
Well, it's a challenge. It's also an opportunity, as we say around here. And one point I would make there is that Angus King, an independent who votes with Democrats, and Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, work hand in glove on these issues. And Maine has identified Portland, Maine as an Arctic port, so it shows some creativity. I came from Los Angeles, and I was underinformed about the opportunities here. And is there ongoing some effort to educate your colleagues in both parties, in both houses, about the enormous risks and opportunities for them if the Arctic becomes even a bigger success story?
Educating colleagues about the reality that the United States is an Arctic nation has been a challenge, because they look at Alaska, they look at my state and say, well, that's the Arctic. You are the Arctic. But the Arctic, the U.S. Arctic, cannot be viewed as one state. We are 50 states, so we are an Arctic nation. But recognizing the significance of the Arctic to someone who lives in Iowa, how do you make that connect? So you talk to them about the advantages that come with shipping lanes that are more readily accessible, that can move product more quickly and thus less expensively. We can speak about the role that the U.S. Arctic plays when it comes from a defense position, from a security position. We can look to the role that the U.S. Arctic plays when it comes to research globally. And so appealing to them from that perspective has been important. We, I think, have gotten beyond the recognition that some had that, well, an icebreaker must just be an earmark for Alaska. Far from it. We will, until it is recognized that this is a national asset, a security asset, not a one-state asset. We know we have not yet succeeded in the education, but we're making some headway. It's not as quickly as I would like, but we're making headway.
Well, you mentioned shipping, and I think most people in the United States are underaware of the potential for the Arctic to be or the primary shipping channel between Asia and Europe. I mean, with the melting of the polar ice cap and innovations in shipping, that could be possible in some near time frame. You've talked a lot about a shipping and ports council. You've also talked possibly about introducing legislation to give this some legs. Can you tell the audience about it?
Well, I think there's going to be opportunity for further details from the Shipping Commission that has been underway and studying and reviewing this seaway that has been patterned off of the St. Lawrence Seaway. But the short term for it has more been Uber icebreakers or icebreakers by Uber, but a reality that there can be more of a sharing, again, a cooperation amongst nations. So there are efforts that are underway, again, discussions amongst not only those in the industry, but those amongst countries to review this. We are looking, the Alaska delegation is actually looking to draft legislation that would help incorporate some of these thoughts and some of these ideas. When it comes to icebreakers, I think it is important to recognize that the Coast Guard and its mission up north is different than that of an escort service, if you will. But it's a pretty big area up there. I think that there is room for all of the above, and how we move this conversation forward, not only here at places like the Arctic Circle, but in the discussions in the United States Senate, in the Congress, are important.
Well, the Wilson Center is very happy to collaborate,
And
co-host.
we appreciate what you have done for that.
And this is a conversation, I think, that could interest most members of Congress. They'll finally understand why they have a stake in this. That's why I brought it up. Time is short, but I do want to ask you also about sustainable development. I attended a lunch today that was hosted by Guggenheim, Scott Meinert, and the World Wildlife Federation. And they talked about collaboration on standards for sustainable development before projects are undertaken. I mean, getting the inputs right. This can be win-win. Just want any thoughts you have on sustainable development.
Well, that's the big buzzword now, sustainable, resilient, and I think it's important to put it in context with the area that you are. I have suggested that there's two Arctics. There is the developed Arctic that you have in the Scandinavian Arctic, and then you have the Arctic that we see in Alaska, in Russia, in Canada, where when you talk about development, the reality is that we are still in a situation where basic infrastructure is lacking. There are no roads. There are very limited ports. In many of the villages that exist along the coast of Alaska, you may be in a situation where there is no running water, no flush toilets, no basic infrastructure. So when we talk about sustainability and what that means, it's sustainability in the sense of quality of life that brings better standards for living conditions, access, again, by way of land and by water, sustainability when it comes to the resource for food and food security, and ensuring that those who have lived in these villages, in these communities, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, have the ability to stay safely, raising their families, educating their children. That's what sustainability needs to look like.
Well, I understand. The clock somehow has just gotten longer, unless I'm misinformed. I think people want this conversation to continue a bit. Am I right? No. Okay, good. Thank you. She's very interesting, isn't she? On this issue of sustainability, though, I know it may be a buzzword, but another person at lunch was Alice Hill, who was in the Obama White House, now at the Hoover Institution, and she was talking about developing standards that not only meet current requirements, but that anticipate the future. For example, sea rise, given climate change. Is there a way, how will this happen? Certainly collaboration, in my view, between private sector and the non-government and the nonprofit sector, like Guggenheim Partners and World Wildlife, is very productive. But how do you get government in this, government thinking forward? Maybe that's an oxymoron, but
you're talking about
that.
Challenges now, and this is a real difficulty for us right now, trying to project out. When we think about the impacts of climate change on a landmass like Alaska that has permafrost, that has thousands and thousands of miles of coastline that are subject to erosion, how do you anticipate where we're going to be 10 years, 20 years from now, and then build infrastructure to that, build energy solutions to that? I'll tell you my dilemma right now, and it has nothing to do with this island that we are on, but it has to do with the island of Puerto Rico that was just heavily damaged by hurricane. Much of their power grid has been knocked out. The mindset that unfortunately we have within our emergency relief is we will rebuild what you had. Well, if you have a system that is inefficient, diesel-powered in an island in the Caribbean, why would we not imagine an energy future for them and help build to that energy future, one that utilizes solar, one that takes advantage of the winds along their shores. And instead, we're poised to rebuild with diesel generation, building backwards in time instead of forwards in time. So you ask a very legitimate question about how do you get the government to do this. This is what gets me up in the morning. This is what keeps me awake at night. It's a challenge, but we have to rise to it. And that's where gatherings like this and what you're doing with the Polar Initiative at the Wilson Center, where you can get good minds who are not in the box. Somebody said this morning, there is no box. There should be no box when we're talking about this.
Well, yes, there should be no box. And Iceland has certainly led the way. I'm looking at President Grimson. I mean, this is a net zero country.
No waste.
Taking
no waste.
advantage of its geothermal gifts. And, it doesn't have every gift, but it certainly has leveraged everything it has. And I certainly would hope, although there could be another volcanic eruption here and other things that would be environmental calamities, but I think Iceland thinks forward. And sadly, in many cases, our own government doesn't think forward. I would just offer, and maybe you agree, that the private sector can lead here. The private sector has huge resources, and if the private sector thinks creatively about sustainable standards and ways, not sustainable standards as of 2017, sustainable standards as of 2050, or whatever the right year might be, and is ready to make that investment, I mean, it seems to me that that is a train the government can jump on.
The private piece, the public-private partnerships truly are key. And I want to follow on what you've just noted, that we're sitting here in Iceland where this innovation, this ingenuity, tapping into the geothermal resources, the hydropower that allows this island to be powered 100% with renewables, which is great. You look at a state like Alaska, and again, we've got some hard statistics, but we too have been challenged, and the ingenuity has been pushed to find some innovative solutions. We are being recognized now as being a world leader when it comes to microgrid solutions. When you have a state that's 1/5 the size of the United States of America, where over 80% of your communities are not connected by road, that means you're also not part of anybody's energy grid, which means that far too many of our communities are just single diesel solutions. So how can we tap into the energy resources that are right there? The wind, the solar, the run of river, the hydro, the biomass, and engineer to these smaller scales. And then take what we're proving out on the ground and use those in other locales, not necessarily in the lower 48, but around the globe. And sometimes the difficult conditions that we face in the Arctic can push us to be the innovators of the world. And this is where we really need to be imagining.
I totally agree. The Minister of Transportation of Finland, a very, very articulate and accomplished woman, was talking yesterday about how Finland, taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Circle, is going to focus on innovation. And innovation, I mean, just start with the obvious, learning what the best practices are in one place and adapting them to another place could make so much difference for not just the Arctic, but for everywhere. And you're right about Puerto Rico. That is a really grim story. And by the way, it is still a very grim tragedy there. I think 90% of the island is still without power. So this, whatever infrastructure they had is completely collapsed. Let me just turn finally to something I mentioned, and you've mentioned Russia in passing. And that is the opportunity for a positive conversation between the United States and Russia. Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Tillerson were together in Fairbanks at this meeting that I mentioned earlier this year. So far as I know, the conversations there, and certainly the conversations with Russian colleagues and people at the Wilson Center, and I think others, have been positive, and there are Russians participating in this meeting. I mean, what do you see as the possible and hopeful outcome of this collaboration between Russia and the U.S.?
We have families that are separated by the Bering Strait. Families on the Alaskan side, families and on the Russian side, and so there are mutual ties, mutual interests, but it goes beyond that. The research that can be shared, and again, the positive outcome from the Fairbanks Ministerial, that research agreement that was written up in part by the Russians. I think that's a great place for us to be working together, clearly in the areas of search and rescue. But we mentioned earlier the seaway and the studies and the collaboration that can go on when it comes to our shipping. When you recognize that there is some 57 miles between Alaska and Russia, just that small, narrow strip there in the Bering Strait, coming together, working collaboratively in kind of outlining the rules of the road, if you will, when it comes to what is moving through the Bering Straits, and using not only our elected government officials, but working with the native people, the indigenous peoples on both sides of the Bering Straits to work out cooperative agreements, recognizing that as we want to encourage shipping going through these areas, we also have hunters who sustain themselves, whether it's the whalers or whether it's those that are out harvesting whale or walrus, a recognition that there needs to be this compatibility in the waters in, again, some areas that are very, very constricted and oftentimes restricted. So when you think about areas of interest, areas of cooperation and collaboration at a time when the political dynamics are not entirely positive, these are areas and ways that we can build relationships.
Well, hopefully, the Arctic Circle and the Wilson Center and the activities
and the
you're
Arctic
undertaking-
parliamentarians.
and the
We
Arctic
visited
parliamentarians.
yesterday, and members from the Russian delegation were there yet again, working with us on just these issues.
There's much more we could talk about. There will be more next year. All I have to say is watch this woman. Those of you who think that the United States Congress is dysfunctional, I often say the business model is broken, but the people aren't. And the stars in the Congress, like Lisa, can make a huge difference, not just in making Congress work better, which would be an aspiration, but in making our world better. So thank you, Senator Lisa Murkowski.
Jane, thank you, and thank you to the Arctic Circle, to President Grimson. Thank you.